Nice to see you, Rory.
A pleasure. Real joy.
Yeah,
strange circumstances, but still.
Strange circumstances, but great to see you. And if you be so kind, would you just introduce yourself and tell us who you are and what you do?
I'm Rory Sutherland. I'm the occasional Spectator contributor. I'm the Vice-Chairman of Ogilvy in London, and I'm also the founder of the behavioural science practice within Ogilvy, which looks to make creative use of insights from behavioural economics and behavioural science to solve problems for, I guess, the public, private and third sector in as many ways as we can.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that. So you were going to appear at Creative North in June this year. Unfortunately, that's not happening, but we've got you here. The theme of the event was collaboration. Would have been collaboration. What are your headline thoughts on collaboration? How do you define collaboration?
I think one answer to this question is, how do we redefine collaboration? Because if nothing else good comes out of this coronavirus crisis, the nature and obviously the location of the people we work with should change significantly and irreversibly, I think, because, I mean, this is not just me talking wish fulfillment, I hope, because I've talked to people from a variety of businesses. One of the things they notice is that when you meet virtually in this way, meetings are less territorial, they're less hierarchical. One large Japanese company was saying to me yesterday how they find that meetings are much more multidisciplinary and less siloed. So instead of it being a marketing meeting or a finance meeting, you actually get a smattering of people from different disciplines, all sharing the same screen, effectively. They've also discovered, interestingly, which I agree with, that you can ideate and, to use an overused term, brainstorm in this way, rather effectively. They never anticipated that. They always thought if there's one thing that requires physical presence, it's any kind of ideation. And they discovered, to their pleasant surprise, even without the use of tools like Miro and Mural and so forth, which you can plug into Zoom to enable whiteboarding collaboration, that kind of thing, that you can do that very, very effectively. And that in many ways, the meetings are more egalitarian and therefore more contributory and collaborative than they were when they were physical.
Okay, that's brilliant.
Which is an interesting finding. I mean, I think a truly interesting finding. And the other thing I've always had a hunch about, and I've never been able to prove it, is I always said, look, what we do is we always try and cram this brainstorming session into one half day or even a full day, because the coordination costs, the diary coordination and the travel costs are such that you basically have to try and do everything within the course of that one occasion. And I've always had this belief that it makes much more sense to split a meeting like that into two. So you have immersion up at the beginning. And that might be just 2 hours. It might be a virtual meeting where everybody familiarizes themselves with the issue at hand. And then you allow for a week or so of what you might call fermentation, to quote James Webb Young in A Technique for Producing Ideas, just to allow the unconscious to do its work. And actually, I'll be honest, to allow yourself a chance to get lucky, because once the problem is in your mind, you might find inspiration in all kinds of accidental things. I once had a kind of flash of inspiration which solved a problem while I was putting the kettle back on its base. And so then, after that week or 10 days, meet again and both assemble the ideas you've had in the meantime and try and build on them and improve them. And I suddenly realized that the only reason you make a brainstorming a one-day all-in-one meeting is nothing to do with the fact that that's actually the ideal way to structure it. It's just because of the sunk costs of getting everybody in the same place. And so I'm very, very, I've been, this isn't just me being a recent sort of, convert. I've been an advocate of Zoom and remote working for about 2 years. With my own team, I not mandated, I never mandate anything, but I basically encourage Zoom Fridays, because I realized that it's not enough to give people permission to work flexibly. You've got to encourage it, because otherwise people kind of have that awkward feeling that it looks like the easy way out. And actually, silly people haven't helped that by, saying working from home with big sort of inverted commas, as though the idea that you're in an office somehow makes you magically more productive. And in my enthusiasm, I was actually backed up by David Ogilvy's observation that he never wrote anything in the office. So his books, his body copy, most of his creative work was done at home, because he simply found the office had too many distractions to be conducive to protracted, deep, contiguous thought.
That's great. That makes perfect sense. And I'm also
so I know this is about collaboration, but I think we've got to talk about the opposite. I think what we've got to talk about is that the creative world is very, very collaborative and social and face-to-face and so forth, but it also requires the absolute polar opposite of that, which is long periods of uninterrupted, concentrated, focused thought. And the modern open plan office, I would argue, is ill-suited to either of those two extremes. It's an attempt to solve for the average, quote from my book, don't try and solve for the average, because actually what people want is many cases, and if you want a great read on this, it's only 1 page of A4, and it's one of the best single pages of A4 ever written. Paul Graham, the founder of Y Combinator, wrote a blog post which is called Manager Schedule versus Maker Schedule. It might be the other way around, actually, Maker Schedule versus Manager Schedule. And he makes the point that a lot of organizations try and run on manager time, which is cram as many meetings into the day as you possibly can, because the more decisions you make, the more productive you are. And he said that if you're talking to a maker, which is a coder or a creative person of any kind, you discover that they get really annoyed if you put a 30-minute meeting in the middle of the afternoon. You go, well, it's just 30 minutes. What the hell? To a manager, that's just 30 minutes. What the hell? But to someone who's trying to do something significantly new or different, that ruins the whole afternoon. And I'd always believed in this very strongly. And then I came to the business of having to write a book. And I discovered that effectively you cannot write a book in the snippets of time remaining in between other things. The only way you can write a book is you take ideally more than 1 day in succession, and during those 1, 2, or 3 days you don't do anything else. And then the weird thing happens, the first day is not very productive, actually. You just get loads of things straight in your head, and then by day 2 and day 3 you're actually producing the words in fairly impressive volume. But there's no way you can write a book by going, oh, I've got 25 minutes now, why don't I just contribute towards chapter 7. And I think understanding that creative people require both extremes, which is the stimulus and hothouse collaboration, and the opposite, which is what I call the library. And the daftest thing is that kind of work that is neither of those two things. And the daftest thing of all is going into the office. I understand that some people don't like working from home, by the way. That's very much a matter of temperament. I have friends who are obsessive about partitioning their home life and their work life. I also, some people just, you've got a lunatic flatmate or young children at home. It's not a, not a great solution. So the office needs to provide for those people to go and find peace and solitude somewhere else. But that business of getting up at 7 o'clock in the morning, traveling in on a crowded train, and then you spend 2 hours in the office doing your email. What's that all about? I mean, your laptop looks exactly the same wherever it is. That's the whole point of inventing the internet, okay? So it strikes me as an extraordinary failure to exploit new technology. Now, I always looked at this because I've spent several years asking exactly this question of why video conferencing is used so little. Because it always struck me as, something which was entirely ridiculous. That there were people who were literally spending £3,000 on a flight to attend a 2-hour meeting. Okay, that's, never mind the environmental cost, there's the financial cost and just the cost in time, effort, and jet lag. And it made no sense. And I think there are a whole mixture of different reasons for it, which all essentially combined to slow the adoption. One of the things being that, as I said, when video conferencing was novel, it was crap. And when it stopped being crap, it was no longer novel. So a lot of people had a memory of video conferencing, which was kind of colored and poisoned by the earlier hopeless experiences of people freezing on screen, and then the sound breaking up and go, Dave, you're on mute, And one of the great things about this is it's forced everybody to become at least tolerably competent at using the technology. And since, the quality of a meeting is determined by the worst participant, that's really, really important. And I think it may represent a kind of a little bit of a quantum leap in the extent to which organizations adopt this. We're certainly asking questions about how much real estate do we now need? What is the office for? Which weren't really asked before.
Yeah, a lot of questions like that in commerce are going to...
Yeah. And actually, it's amazing how... one cheeky point I will make is that if an organization's travel and entertainment costs had been mostly incurred by junior staff, there would have been pressure to video conference 5 years earlier, okay? But it tended to be the senior management who was on all these junkets and zooting around the place. And so,
Rory, that's great. It's really interesting. Really interesting. Put your mind forward to next month, this event that's not happening now. Imagine a room full of expectant copywriters and marketers. What were you thinking of talking about at the event with regards to collaboration? How it's impacted on you and it's benefited your career?
I was going to take a bit of a left field thing because, as a copywriter for 25 years, I have no doubt in my mind that the purpose of, it was always beautifully said, the purpose of a creative team, copywriter and art director, is to create a third person who's better than either of you. And much of the time, not all of the time, as I said, there are certain things which, you need to have a certain amount of staring into space-time. But there's no doubt in my mind at all that collaboration can actually, the standing on the shoulders of giants effect. You can create something better between a group of people than you might do on your own, if only through just feedback, suggestions, and actually the sounding board effect as well, which is never bad. You can, get very deluded about the quality of your work. David Ogilvy was absolutely assiduous, or at least he claims he was. If I'd founded the company, I'd basically write the copy and go, look at this, everybody, it's brilliant. And I think David was conscious of that risk, which is everybody go, oh, David, you're so clever. And he'd actually show a piece of body copy to sort of 6 people and ask for comments before he sent it through to a client. And that weird reluctance to listen to, constructive feedback, I think is a dangerous thing that has to be overcome within reason. Obviously, you've got to choose the right 6 people. But what I was planning to talk about was an interesting thing, which was rather different, which was not internal collaboration, but external. And I was going to ask the question of who does an ad agency, a creative agency, work with? In other words, who do we look to be our clients? And because who we consider our clients to be has a major effect on what we'll get good at, okay? And my contention is that when we went from payment by commission, which hasn't really existed since 1992 or something, I mean, it was pretty much on the way out before then. But when we stopped being paid on commission, we entirely failed to spot the opportunity that hourly fees did bring. There are a lot of disadvantages to hourly fees. It's a deeply unsatisfactory way of charging because it doesn't correlate with value at all, okay? But there is one upside to charging by some sort of fee rather than charging by media commission, which is that you can now work with a vastly wider range of problem owner than you could before. And we didn't do that. What we did is we basically went, what's our job? Our job is to solve business problems for people who have a big media budget. Well, that was true when you were paid on commission to some extent. It was certainly not true subsequently. And for every person with an interesting problem that could be solved through a mixture of creativity and human insight, who also has a big media budget, there are hundreds and hundreds of people who have problems but don't have a media, don't spend money on media or comms. And the idea that we should confine ourselves only to comms problems seems to involve an incredibly self-limiting belief, which is, what you find within an ad agency, I mean, Dave Trott always quotes me on this, which is usually I'm quoting him, so I'm rather flattered when it happens the other way around. But one of the great things that advertising inculcates in you is a kind of fear of the obvious, which is in some ways part of the creative instinct. It's a horror of the obvious. No. It can't. Now, sometimes it can go wrong. Sometimes the answer is obvious, but when the answer is obvious, there's no shortage of people who can solve it, after all. And so that mental business where you look deeper into human motivation and you look deeper into the problem, and you ask, my colleague Chris Graves in New York calls this the real why, because everybody has an official why as to why they do something, why they chose this brand of car, why they bought this, why they bought a house where they did. But underneath that, there's a deeper unconscious why, which in marketing you have to understand, because that's the prime motivation. And the value of creative problem solving, particularly when married to behavioral science, which kind of codifies and provides a scientific rigor to experimentation and measurement and so forth, seems to be enormous, because you don't get management consultancies going, we only solve problems for large advertisers. We're not interested. If someone comes to us from Rolls-Royce Aero Engines, well, we ask, how much do you spend on advertising? Because if it's not a lot, we're not going to talk to you. You can't imagine McKinsey saying that, can you? So why do we have this insanely self-limiting belief in the value of creativity, that it should be confined to the communications part? Now, that's a bigger problem because, okay, in big ad spend companies, marketing is a significant part of the mental mindset and toolbox of the company, if you're a packaged goods company. But broadly speaking, there are very many large organizations, not least B2B organizations, for example, where the actual comms budget is a rounding error in terms of what they do. Now, those companies are just as much in need of creative solutions to things or creative suggestions as packaged goods companies, but we've never really developed the skill set to talk to them, because we assumed that the only people we could be any use to were people. And I always said that this is a bit like running a hospital, and you've got a general hospital, but you've got a sign above the door saying cosmetic surgery, as if you can't solve anything else. And I worry about that, because the conflation of creativity with a very narrow field of kind of problem solving is a complete mistake.
Do you see this thinking playing out, and what sort of problems would you consider in this way, or would it apply?
So, okay, in organizations where marketing is less powerful because its budgets are tiny and it's seen as a comms function, which is very, very dangerous. Marcoms is a terrible word, because it essentially stereotypes marketing as a kind of arty discipline, not as a problem-solving, value creation approach. And it tends to miss the fact that actually marketing isn't, in any case, it's not a support function, it's a mindset. And it has a mindset which is highly complementary to the mindset of the rest of the organization, typically. So what makes the marketing viewpoint unique is you tend to look at a problem through the eyes of a customer over time, not through the eyes of the organization or through the lens of a spreadsheet or through the aggregation of financial and other data. You see it from a psychological and perceptual perspective, not from an economic perspective, for example, or an engineering perspective. And the importance of that mindset as one of the ways of looking at a problem is vital, because without that mindset, you end up with a very narrow solution space for any problem. We have to change objective reality to make this problem go away. And the marketing mindset would say, well, maybe you don't have to change the objective reality. You just have to change the customer's expectation, for example. The problem here, just as the marketing solution to transport, the single best thing London Transport did supposedly to improve passenger experience per pound wasn't faster, more frequent, more comfortable, later running trains. It was dot matrix displays on the platform And it's based on the very human insight that what people don't like isn't actually, it's not the waiting, that's an objective measure, it's the uncertainty, that's a subjective measure. And people would rather wait 9 minutes for a train knowing there's a train in 9 minutes than wait 7 minutes or 6 minutes. And so the way to solve that problem, in fact, is not necessarily to solve it as an engineering problem, it's to solve it as a psychological problem, which costs literally, 1% of the cost of running an extra train. And so it's vitally important that all organizations, including government organizations, policymakers, charity organizations, and so forth, are reasonably well appraised of a marketer's eye of a problem and the marketer's eye view alongside all the other views they may have. Because the way you look at a problem essentially limits how you might solve it. So an engineer will tend to define it as an engineering problem, a lawyer will tend to define it as a legal problem. And if you don't have the, what you might call the creative, psychological, perceptual angle on a problem, you can end up totally misdefining what the nature of the problem is. You can end up performing incredibly expensive solutions where simple ones would do. Okay, I'll tell you an anecdote about this, which I always love. I think it does have a background in truth, which is, an organization where everybody complained the lifts were too slow. And, one option was you spend $500,000, we install new winding gear, we upgrade the lift shaft and so forth. And someone said, well, actually, before you do that, before you lam out $500,000, just try putting mirrors, floor-to-ceiling mirrors between the lift doors on every floor. And all the complaints stopped. And the insight there was actually people said the lifts are too slow. What they really mean is I get bored waiting for the lift. I feel like a dick waiting for the lift, whatever it may be. Okay. And the point there is to understand the real why is actually frustration and uncertainty or whatever, or the pointlessness of staring at a wall is the real why of the problem. And an engineer would always take that complaint at face value and go, this is about velocity.
Okay, very interesting. How might we take this advice, insight into our careers and help us be better copywriters and marketers? What takeaways would you give from your imagine you're there at the presentation? What should we go away thinking?
So one, don't confine yourself to talking to the kind of people who go to Cannes, and this is very important, particularly many of those people are all clustered in London and various megacities in any case. And the joy of behavioral science and the behavioral science approach is it's scalable. So you can, one of the things we do is we work with small organizations. Sometimes, it doesn't make perfect economic sense. But the reason we do it is you can learn things working for a coffee shop that you could apply to Starbucks, for example. And so, to be honest, good copywriters, good creative people, good advertising people in general knew a lot of this stuff instinctively anyway. In fact, there's a comment by Amos Tversky, who is Daniel Kahneman's great collaborator, that he said, what Daniel and I do is we take things that advertising executives and used car salesmen already know instinctively, and we give them a scientific framework. And the interesting thing about that is that indeed, advertising executives kind of knew it instinctively, but there were two problems. One, they never codified it. So you could never take an insight you'd learned in one bit of business and see if it would work somewhere else. So they were very bad at taking the insights across categories. And the second thing is, I don't think they had a very good vocabulary to sell the thing. So it was fine if you're an entrepreneur, if you're a used car salesman, you'd understand that actually putting money on the trade-in price you offer someone is more effective than reducing the purchase price of their new car by the same amount, for example. And you might learn that instinctively and practice it. Subsequently, that was used in the Cash for Clunkers program, where they realized that actually it seems much more impressive to get an extra £2,000 on a £7,000 trade-in price than to get £2,000 off a £20,000 car. And There are probably a load of other benefits there, by the way, which are worth remembering, which is if you get a reasonable trade-in price, it means you no longer feel you have to try and sell the car privately to get slightly more money, which is a royal pain in the arse, involving tire kickers coming round to your house and ringing you all the time. Okay, and the risk your car gets nicked to order, which sometimes happens if you advertise a car, by the way. And you can avoid all that hassle and guiltlessly then trade in your car knowing you've got a reasonable amount for it. And so understanding that, which is that there's a huge psychological difference between two things which are, to an economist, indistinguishable. You save £2,000 either way, why should you care? Okay, and that, now you can take that insight even further and say, okay, what you call things matters. Why in God's name do we refer to them as student loans rather than having the same financial mechanism but calling it a graduate tax? Because the reaction to those two different things, even though the economic effects may be indistinguishable, the reaction to how those things make you feel is totally different.
Yeah, no, I get that.
Funnily enough, I think Nick Clegg, apparently someone said that Nick Clegg occasionally wakes up in the middle of the night and goes, if only we'd called it a graduate tax.
No, that's good. That's great. I mean, carrying on for that, I mean, collaboration being the theme, are there any aspects of collaboration? What would make a copywriter a better collaborator, more valuable, more useful? Are there any skills in particular copywriters, marketers generally ought to work on or develop?
Yeah, one advantage I had, and I learned this when I became an enthusiast for behavioral science, was most of my life as a copywriter, I was a direct marketing copywriter. And one of the great advantages of direct marketing was you could teach other people because there was a language, okay? There were words, phrases like call to action, for example. And so around direct marketing, along with the sort of slightly comical vocabulary like Johnson box and bangtail and so forth, don't worry what those are, okay, necessarily. There was a whole vocabulary of describe, so you could critique other people's work using a sensible and helpful kind of vocabulary. And I think sometimes dangerously in general advertising, you lack that. So you can go, nah, it's shit, and actually it's much harder to actually collaborate when you don't have a kind of a set of words you can use to say, what's missing effectively. And so that's one useful thing for copywriters. Another useful thing, by the way, is do learn from the oldies. So when people tell you to read books by Claude Hopkins or James Webb Young, read those books alongside the books by, the D&AD copybook is fantastic, by the way. But read both the work of the oldsters and the work of the newbies, because, as Bernbach says, human nature doesn't change all that much. And actually, what you can see is you can see people in programmatic digital advertising effectively rediscovering things which were already known in the 1920s about what works. One bit of oldie advice I was given very early on as a copywriter, when you were doing an off-the-page ad, which is an ad which had a coupon. I mean, they barely exist anymore now. You have a web address. Although, funnily enough, it's probably a good idea to include a coupon, because even if nobody clips it, it tells people that it's a direct response ad. So there may be something in that. And one of the bits of advice that I was always given was start with a coupon. Bloody hell. What are these oldies talking about? You start with a headline. You want a bold headline with a striking visual. You start with a concept. And it was years later that I realized they were kind of right. And the point I'm making is that if the final bit of your customer journey isn't optimal, it doesn't matter how good you are further upstream, because you'll still be wasting sales. And I took that into a much wider lesson, which is when you look at optimizing customer experience and the customer journey, We should start at the end. We tend to start far out with what's the brand perception, where, no. I said, no. That needs to be got right. Don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting it's unimportant. But the first thing to say is, what's our retention like? In other words, what's our rate of repeat purchase like? Because if that's no good, you haven't really got a business. You're just selling a product to everybody in the world once. That's not really a business. Then you've got to look at things like conversion and so forth, because there's no point in widening a road if there's a badly phased set of traffic lights 200 yards further on. What you've got to do is you've got to optimize a journey from the end point and work forwards. And we tend not to do that. And I think that's a mistake, because I actually know of an anecdotal story, and I can't name the brand because actually the person who told me the story couldn't name the brand either. They weren't allowed to. But it was a very, very successful advertising campaign for a luxury car, campaign which subsequently ran for many years. And yet, when they started running the campaign, they saw no upsurge in sales of the car. No effect. And now, a boring person would have taken that to mean that the advertising campaign was ineffectual. And this chap was a great expert in complexity theory, and he looked at the graph, and he said, this sales graph is just a straight line from month to month. And I said, yeah. Yeah. He said, no. He said, there's something wrong. You never get that. He said, in the real world, if you've got a straight line, there's something wrong. There's a constraint. He said, either your salesmen are faking the sales figures, i.e. they're moving sales back and forwards from one month to another in order to meet some target. No, it wasn't that. So he said, okay, there's some limitation on how many cars you can sell. And they went and checked, and they discovered that obviously the company made a lot of money from financing cars, not just selling them. And so they'd issued a mandate earlier that nobody could test drive a car until they'd had a chat with the finance guy within the dealership. And there was only one finance guy within the dealership. He was often busy. So people would come in, and they'd either have to come back because they couldn't test drive the car until they'd seen Mr. Numbers, or else the people go, well, if I can't test drive this car here, I'll piss off and buy a Mercedes instead, okay? And so the availability of the finance guy was basically constraining the number of cars they could sell. And so until they removed that constraint, the advertising was entirely pointless, because all it was doing was just driving people to dealerships where they then become frustrated. And so once they released it, fortunately, it proved, and the ad campaign ran for many, many years, it proved hugely successful. And one of the things I do say is that if you haven't optimized, the last mile, stop worrying about earlier miles, because that's where you've got to focus your attention first. And so, what's quite interesting is quite a lot of the lessons of early 1920s and 30s direct marketing are still applicable. And the reason they're still applicable is because fundamentally human nature doesn't change very much. And so discounting stuff as old school, which, I've seen digital people love doing this. The worst kind of digital person goes, yeah, whatever, grandpa, I'm not interested in your stupid ink knowledge, right? But actually, fundamentally how you persuade someone to do something, there's an enormous amount of overlap between ink and pixels.
Absolutely. I mean, you used the phrase, I was at an event you spoke at, and you used, the first time I'd heard it, arithmocrats. And I think...
I mean, the arithmocracy, yeah.
Arithmocracy.
And we've got to watch that, because it's the idea that if you favor numerical data, which of course can be aggregated and combined and multiplied and everything else, you may end up completely blind to the important facets of what you do, which simply aren't capable of numerical expression. So this leads companies, I think, to set completely dumb metrics. Just to give an example, there is a metric for train reliability, but there isn't a metric for passenger uncertainty. And so you end up solving for train regularity rather than solving for the core problem, which is, passenger frustration. And so that's a huge bias. My goodness, that was quite a few years ago. By the way, I must give credit. The arithmocracy was a phrase invented by Anthony Tasgell, who's a very, very good planner and very good commentator on marketing matters. and he coined this phrase, the arithmocracy, which is businesses increasingly get run by this kind of left-brainish cabal of people who think that if only you have enough data, all things become knowable and optimizable and solvable.
It's an interesting thing, Rory. I was talking with Nadia Koja, who's going to also present at the event. I was saying to her about collaboration, and she was saying that a way of adding more value as a copywriter or a creative would be to engage with numbers better, to not just think left brain, right brain, and to accept, because we often pigeonhole ourselves, don't we? I'm a left brain person.
No, I mean, this, by the way, doesn't just happen in creative businesses. It's a problem for the whole of marketing, which is, someone was telling me that they worked for an insurance company as the marketing director, and someone was deputized to the marketing department from something like data analytics. And they said, I don't know what on earth I'm going to be doing in marketing because I'm terrible at drawing. And you go, oh, shit. They really think like that? This is a catastrophe. Because no, I mean, one of the weird things is I did A-level maths, which, you know, I mean, my brother's a proper mathematician. I'm shit at it. But having A-level maths practically makes you Archimedes within the advertising industry. And by the way, I mean, you could only, I mean, the most dangerous thing you can do is reject the numerical out of hand. What I'm saying is, good mathematicians, by the way, are equally conscious of the limitations of mathematical modeling. In other words, the things you can't capture, which might matter a great deal. And I think it's only reasonable, if we're asking for those people to recognize, you know, the weaknesses of their discipline, that we at least spend some time understanding their strengths. And by the way, you know, let's face it, behavioral data is damn great as a substitute for market research findings, because when someone does something differently in response to your communication, you can inarguably make the point that whatever you've achieved something. And so it's much, much better to measure the effect of what you do on what people do than enjoying that proxy measure of what do people think about you, which may or may not translate into any kind of meaningful action.
That's great. That's really, really interesting. Really.
So that's a really good tip, by the way, which is, you know, at Ogilvy, the do brief, every single brief contains this phrase, what do we want people to do differently as a result of this? Because, and by the way, that also helps you bridge the gap with the left. So Nadja's absolutely right. One of the reasons that helps you bridge the gap with the numbers people is you can put a value on a behavior. You can't put a value on an attitude. Yeah, and it's only reasonable we should seek to do something which is at some point measurable.
They say your value is the difference you make, and if that difference is measurable, then it's easy to calculate. More easy to calculate the value.
And you know, I mean, you know, this is an applied art. You know, we're here to do a job. I mean, you know, emphatically, and so. I think, you know, it's absolutely vital that you should be interested in. I mean, I find it utterly bizarre in people, and there's a huge danger of that, which is the ad industry trying to impress each other. Because it's worth remembering, people in the ad industry, by the way, actually, that's kind of okay. If the ad industry is trying to impress other advertising people, and your client is a highly creative entity with a customer base very similar to us, maybe that's not a bad thing, okay? But the fact is, I don't think Madison Avenue understands Main Street very well. And it's very, very easy to do things which are incredibly impressive to a peer group, but entirely unmotivating to the person you're trying to sell to. I mean, ad people are, well, they're overwhelmingly, by the way, and maybe Zoom can change this a bit, but people working in advertising are overwhelmingly metropolitan. And you notice things, and you know, this worried me about the Brexit debate, because on Brexit, I'm one of the very rare people who is basically completely on the fence. You know, I didn't think, you know, I voted Remain, but I didn't, you know, I didn't think it was that important, to be absolutely honest. I was in a tiny minority of people who went, look, you know, you weren't that bothered about this thing beforehand. Why are you that? You know, it's not like, you know, I live in Kent, okay? I'm very fond of Kent, but, you know, I'm not that bothered about Kent County Council. That's not where I draw my identity from. And so, okay, so you don't belong to a supranational thing, whoop-de-doo, And one of the things I noticed in the ad industry, where you quite commonly get, I think, 95% of people in media agencies, and it would have been around 90% of people in creative agencies voted Remain. That's fine, by the way. I've got no problem with that. Where I do have a problem is if you are totally incomprehending of the reasons why people would vote Leave. At this point, you're not even trying to understand people. This is worrying. Because the second I heard people going, all these thick old people, I was going, oh God, this is shitting terrifying, right? Because if there's one thing which is a requirement of someone working in this business, it's the ability at least to try to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And then, of course, it led to really strange things, which is, nobody ever changed anybody's mind by insulting them. Okay? So if you were genuinely trying to change people's minds, this was catastrophic, because if anything confirmed, okay, so not only do you disagree with me, but you're now patronizing me.
Well, I guess we'll find out in due course.
But of course, what's interesting about COVID is, in a sense, it's proved that this isn't that big a deal. I mean, it isn't that big a deal. It's in the scheme of what really matters in life. It's one of those things like the Corn Laws, which, if you're interested in, I can't remember where the bloody hell it happened, but British history, there seems to be a period of 15 years where 90% of press is covering the Corn Laws. And actually, I can't even remember which way it went. It ends up being one of those things like the Wars of the Roses. In the end, it kind of got resolved, and nothing really made that much difference.
Rory, that's great. I think we'll wrap up there.
Who did win the Wars of the Roses? You're presumably in Manchester, so you'll say the Lancastrians, will you? I don't know. Yeah. I can never remember. But anyway, and what I'm saying is that it's one of these extraordinary things which it creates extraordinary polarization. But the truth of the matter is the polarization emerged because people were forced to pick sides. And I was in this weird minority of people who go, well, look, the majority of people voted Leave, so we should probably just leave because that's what people want. But I couldn't get worked up about it. The only thing that worked me up was the level of patronization towards people who disagreed, which was truly horrifying.
Yeah, no, fair point. But we really should wrap up now. I have a feeling that if this had gone ahead in Manchester on the in June as scheduled, I'd have had to have a big shepherd's crook, and I'd have stood stage and gone. That was great. That
would have been rather fun, actually. It has happened before, not with the crook, but the next best thing. Yeah, certainly. All sorts of noises, people waving at me. It has happened.
That was a extensive question answering there, Rory. Thank you very much. I sincerely appreciate it, and very much hope we can get you up to Manchester to speak at Creative North in the not too distant future.
I love the trip, partly because the other interesting thing is that the extent to which I think we'll have to rethink our own real estate, and the extent to which the London ad industry is paying twice, because we're paying real estate prices for our offices, but we're also essentially, when we pay our staff, half of the after-tax money is disappearing into the pockets of some buy-to-let landlord. We'll have to rethink how we collaborate across geographies. And obviously, in a weird way, Zoom was always, video conferencing was always sold as the alternative to air travel, because that's the most impressive financial case. Actually, it's not. The principal use of Zoom may be a way in which one member of my team can spend 5 days of the week in Sheffield, rather than having to bankrupt himself with travel costs or accommodation costs. And we forgot that. In a way, what we should have done is we should have made it the better alternative to a phone call, not the poor man's British Airways. And that's one of my many reasons why I think video conferencing was missold. It was sold as the cheaper but inferior version to something good, rather than the vastly superior alternative to something bad. And so that misframing and mispositioning may have contributed to the slow uptake.
Well, I think we've pretty much got there now with it, haven't we? I mean, people.
Yep, 10 years earlier than it might have taken, I suspect. Yeah.
Yeah. Rory, thank you so much for your time and your insight and input there. It's really appreciaed.
Martin, huge pleasure. Anytime. Really delighted. And if you don't get the recording, obviously tip me an email, because I've got one of my own as well. I'll now actually stop that. But let me know if you don't, for some reason, get a recording copy of your own, because I'll obviously be able to send you mine.
Perfect. And all that leaves for me to say is thanks for your time, and we'll see you in Manchester soon, hopefully.
You will, I promise. Thanks ever so much.
Cheers, Rory.
All the best.